Okay, so this one is going to be, I guess, about the best title I can think of is martial differentiation and maneuvers and stuff. So it's no secret 5e has a problem with the martial caster divide, blah blah blah. That's been talked about to death, and all the different ways you can solve it. Simply just give better weapons. That's it. Like, martials are very dependent upon getting magic weapons in some way. But that's not really what I'm talking about here. So, something that's been a thing, especially if you've been playing a single martial character for a while, you might start to get some fatigue. Like, I guess I'm just going to call it I swing my weapon fatigue, where, it gets a little boring. I swing my weapon twice every turn, and that's it. So, giving a martial character some extra abilities is, I think, really important. One, in my SCP game, the first time I ran it, the only martial I had was a rogue, who was a arcane trickster rogue, because of course. So literally everyone was a spellcaster in the first time I ran this game. But now I think I've got at least one monk. So going forward, he'll probably start to get those types of things, especially because as a monk, you've got the natural key resource, so that can give you some interesting things to do. But not the point. Really, the reason I'm talking about this is, since I'm just trying to avoid all the rough road right here to cover up, not trying to drown myself out. So, ever since Space Marine 2 came out and I started playing that a lot, start seeing Warhammer stuff and not even looking up exactly how the game tabletop works. You start to get it a little bit by osmosis. And something I just saw was, some of the bigger units, particularly things like Primarchs and, what in other games I guess might be called like hero units. I don't know exactly what they get called in the Warhammer, in the 40k tabletop, like if they have a specific designation, or if there's like a community designation, like something like hero units, or your big unit, whatever you want to call it. But not the point. A lot of units like that seem to have, at least looking at like their melee abilities, they've got a strike and a sweep. I don't know if those cost different things or what, but one thing I noticed, like, there's a bunch of different stats and stuff. Presumably, a strike is on a single target, and a sweep is on a bunch of targets. And it looked like a strike has, like, the example was Angron. Like, the strike did, like, I think 8 dice, and the sweep did 16 dice, so double the dice. So, I'm going to guess how this works is possibly a strike is, maybe they can do more than one strike on a turn, maybe they can only do one sweep on a turn, but in general, something like a strike implies a single target, so you can apply all 8 of those roll to hit dice against a single target, whereas in a sweep, yeah, you're affecting a big area and you're rolling double the dice, but you can probably only apply a single die to a single target. Like, if you roll like 8 6s, you've only got those 8 6s to spread around on all the possible targets of that sweep, something like that. And I was thinking, especially for the Shadow in the Warp game, maybe that's something marshals should have. I mean, it's already, like, from the last game we played, it already seems like marshals are a lot more potent than spellcasters are in that game for a few reasons. One, because the and this is something we talked about, the conversion document, it just makes spellcasters a bit weaker. They don't have, for some reason, they have reduced spell points compared to what they would normally have in something like 5e. And then also just some of the spells are a little, like the spell lists are cut back a little bit, so they have slightly less options. And then in particular for the Psyker, which is like a sorcerer wizard amalgam, the meta magic, or the meta magic equivalent, uses spell points, so they don't get a separate resource to use meta magic. So if you're trying to use meta magic and cast spells, you're going to burn through your spell point resources extremely quickly. So we started to homebrew a little bit, and by we I mean mostly the DM and the other Psyker player. They started to homebrew some solutions, things like, you know, something closer to the way it spellcasting is psyching? Being a psyker? Casting spells from the warp actually works, where, you know, when you try to cast a spell, there's always a chance you could explode and demons could come out. But, so like, you know, whenever you cast a spell, you can roll a die, and then if it's bad, use some of your spells, use your spell points to modify it. Like, basically, you're always going to be, I think it's, what's the system? I think it's White Wolf. I think it was the same DM was telling me about how it works, where, you know, casting magic is inherently dangerous, but you can kind of always do it. You can always just try to cast a spell, but whenever you do it, you got to roll, and if it's bad, a bad thing happens. But if it's good, you just kind of cast the spell normally. So theoretically, the way it would work is you can always cast spells, but you then roll a die, and if it's bad, you can choose to use some spell points to modify it, so that essentially it's more of like a fatigue, like the spell points are more of like a fatigue resource, or a stamina resource, or like an anti-stress, like, you know, there's lots of different ways to describe it, but something like that to allow a little more flexibility. And for lower level spells, you can just try to risk it and maybe take on a minor penalty sometimes, like, oh, like you take a little damage, or you spawn an imp next to you, and it's like, and it's mad, it tries to attack you, like, oh no, an imp, crush. Something like that would be funny, but, you know, again, not the point. The main reason I bring this up is, so when you're using, you know, we were using martial characters, and particularly something, it really, especially if it's 5e, it favored more attacks versus a bigger weapon, because one, cleave isn't really a thing. We discussed putting cleave in, like, and that was going to be something the DM was going to work on, and I guess they got to start working on that. But putting cleave in, so when you're attacking attacking a small targets, you can cleave through and, you know, get some carryover damage, because a lot of the small grunts are kind of like right at that threshold where you got to roll like max damage to kill them in one hit. So I was thinking, would adding something analogous to like a strike versus sweep be better? You know, when as a martial you go to attack with melee weapons. I don't know how this would interact with ranged weapons. I guess it probably wouldn't. But something like, okay, you choose to attack with your melee weapons, you can choose strike or sweep. And if you choose strike, then you get all of your extra attacks, and, you know, however many you get. You get extra attack and offhand weapons and stuff. So my ranger, courser, would get, 2 main attacks and 2 offhand attacks. So he could attack 4 targets, or however it would work. Or you could do a sweep attack, where you would attack essentially everything in range, I guess. I think we're still medium creatures, right? Not the point. Doesn't matter. So, how would that work? I'm guessing something like you have a determined sweep range, I guess determined by your weapons. And I would assume it would, you can kind of loosely tie it to maybe the weapon's range, obviously. Then other factors could be like the weapon's damage die, whether the weapon's light, two-handed, what the other properties are. So something like a light weapon would probably have the lowest sweep range, whereas something like a heavy two-handed reach weapon would have the biggest sweep range. And whether it's like, I'm not going to say a 15-foot cone, because cone isn't the best one. It would be an arc. And arc isn't something that 5e uses, but it would be like, a 15-foot arc hits, 3 squares in front of you. It hits 15 square, like 15 range. It hits 1 5-foot square, 2 5-foot square, 3 5-foot square. So it'll hit 3 in front of you. But then something like a 20-foot would hit 4 squares in front of you, and you could, I guess, angle it however you want. I'm at a stoplight now. Or maybe it should change in increments of 3 or odds. So it would be like 5 foot, 15, 25. And then you could also start to add some in the front. So it would be like, whether you go wider or deeper could also be a factor for your weapons. Like maybe you can't get the deep arc. You can only affect one depth of squares in front of you. So you can, go 5 or 15 or 25 or however much, and maybe eventually go in a whole circle around you and attack everything. But if you've got like a reach weapon or a two-handed weapon or just a bigger weapon, then you could start to affect a second ring of targets, something like that. So, I guess how would that work? Maybe. I don't know. How would that work? I guess you would have to differentiate. Whereas strike is generally going to be better for attacking single targets, and sweep is better for attacking multiple targets. So maybe you could make it so it doesn't look at your extra attack anymore. You don't get extra attack to it, and it just say like, okay, for our current group, someone like Koro would get essentially one sweep. You'd get one sweep and just hit in front of him. Maybe get some good range to it, because it's a one-handed sword. So maybe he'd have a larger arc than someone like Ragnil, who's using 2 light weapons. But then how would the light weapons work? I don't know, maybe he would have a smaller arc, but he could sweep twice? Or maybe everything in the arc could be affected twice. Maybe that's how it would work. But then how would it work for what do you call it? Asterion. Or the monk analog, he's the augmenticist. And their whole thing is like, they've got integrated weapons into their body, and they can kind of use them freely without having to rely on two-handed weapon rule or two-weapon fighting rules. So like, maybe he'd get a sweep with each weapon. I think he's got a spear and a chain fist, So maybe he would just get 2 independent sweeps. So he would be even better at using these sweep attacks than like Koro would, or than anybody else would. This would be a whole separate like kind of action, but like it'd be a subset of the attack action, and it would sweep instead of attack, or we could differentiate from strike and sweep. So it would be like, theoretically, Ragneil might be the weakest at sweep because he would have the lowest range, because it's light weapons. Then Koro and Asterion would both kind of be equally good at it because they've got like, you know, the medium and versatile weapons, like the, you know, the normal one-handed weapons. That's what they're using. But maybe the Augmenticist rules would let Asterion get just a bigger sweep or something along those lines. But going back, Ragneil having 2 weapons, like explicitly using 2-weapon fighting, like maybe he would either get, like, you know, maybe he would get just smaller sweeps, but he could sweep twice, or he'd have 2 individual sweep arcs. Like, instead of a 15 in front of him, he'd have 2 15s that are angled, like based on his 2-handed, like, you know, and they intersect in front of him. So like maybe targets that are directly in front of him, maybe he'd have a small range that he'd be able to affect with both hits of it, with like the 2 sweeps, maybe something like that. So weapon choice and stuff could matter there. So like Ragneil would effectively have a 20-foot sweep with the 2, by having 2 15-foot arcs angled slightly in front of him. Or oh wow, I'm pretty early. Damn. I'm just gonna grab some food now. Yeah, you could have two sweeps in front of him, whereas like Koro would just have a wider sweep, and I guess Asterion would have the same thing because they're the same kind of weapons he's got. So something like that. But that's just, I'm just spitballing. I'm coming up with some ideas, and like I think it'll matter because, you know, we're running into like huge amounts of enemies. Like we fought 60 dudes. So being able to attack a large group at once without having to rely on the DM swarmifying a big group of enemies, I think would be a big thing. And it would also apply some like kind of meaningful choice to our actions. Like strike would still allow like someone like Ragneil to attack a single target 4 times. But yeah, again, I'm just spitballing. Feel free to give me some thoughts. That's all I got for you today.